Welcome to my channel. My name is Antonio Gervasoni. I'm a Peruvian composer and university professor, and this is the first video in my series on orchestration, which aims to introduce you to some key aspects of this wonderful art. In this video, I'll explain how foreground and background concepts apply to orchestration. In the first video of my series on music composition, I talked about the psychological aspects involved in the perception of works of art and mentioned Gestalt psychology and its principles. One of these principles is the figure-ground principle, which states that we perceive objects either in the foreground or in the background. In other words, they stand out or remain as part of a dark and less prominent field. Although conceived to understand visual information, Gestalt psychology can also be used to explain our perception of music. Almost all the Gestalt principles can be applied to music, but one that plays an important role in orchestration is the figure-ground principle. You see, in a solo instrument piece, the player must emphasize some notes to bring out an important element of the music. In the orchestra, however, this can be achieved in other ways, which I'll briefly comment on below. The first way to make an element, such as a melody, stand out in an orchestration is to simply set a small number of instruments, or even a solo instrument, against a larger ensemble, or even the entire rest of the orchestra. Of course, dynamics are very important in this case. A solo flute, for example, will have little chance of standing out if the rest of the orchestra is playing fortissimo, even if the flute is playing at the same dynamic level. When the orchestrator wants the whole orchestra to participate, especially in loud passages, it's very common to double the element that should stand out on other instruments. This doubling can be in unison or in different octaves, depending on the character of the music and the intentions of the orchestrator. Another way to ensure that a musical element stands out from the rest is simply by giving the musician or musicians involved in its performance a higher dynamic level than the rest of the orchestra, or vice versa, that is, giving the orchestra a lower dynamic level. This is especially important when the element in question must be played in a register where the instrument or instruments are less prominent. However, there are cases where even this will not work. A clarinet that plays in its low register has no chance of standing out from a loud orchestral background, even if it plays in its strongest dynamics, not even if it's doubled by another clarinet. Therefore, choosing the right instrument or instruments is a very important factor when using dynamics to highlight certain elements of the music. The register can also be used to emphasize a certain element in music. Within a group of simultaneous pitches, as in a chord for example, the highest and lowest pitches are always easier to distinguish. It's a matter of auditory perception. In a chord progression, then, the highest and lowest pitch sequences are always easier to follow, and for this reason attract our attention, especially the highest sequence, which usually corresponds to the most important melody in a composition. What happens between them is less clear to us. Orchestration can take advantage of this to bring out some musical element. If the sound power of all instruments is well balanced, the highest melody should be clear enough to grab our attention, unless something in the same register is clouding it. To be even more sure, the orchestrator can add some doublings of the melody so that its presence is assured. It's like drawing a thin black line on a cartoon. orchestrators can also use timbre to highlight some element of the music. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, timbre is the quality of tone distinctive of a particular singing voice or musical instrument. In other words, it's what allows us to discern between one instrument and another. It's what makes us know that we're listening to a saxophone and not a flute. Just as some colors stand out from others, so do timbres. In the orchestra, the oboe and the trumpet are very easy to spot, even when the entire orchestra is playing at the same time. By the way, for this reason, they are also more difficult to combine with other instruments. For less characteristic timbres, there's another strategy. Don't give other simultaneous sounds to instruments of the same timbre. For example, if the main melody will be played by one trumpet, don't use a second trumpet to play other pitches at the same time, especially if the instruments are close to each other in terms of pitch. And if the second trumpet is absolutely necessary for balance reasons, double the melody of the first on another timbre, or use some other strategy, like higher dynamics, to make the melody stand out. A certain element of the music can also be highlighted by using different articulations, although this requires that the musical character of the piece be in accordance with the specific selection. Take, for example, this passage from a piano piece by Tchaikovsky. The score has no staccatos, but if you listen to a recording, you'll see that the left-hand part is always played staccato. It's not that Tchaikovsky forgot to put the articulation, he simply deemed it unnecessary, as there is no other way to play a passage like that on the piano. In an orchestra, we can have several instruments playing with different articulations, like this passage from Ravel's orchestration of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. So even if you have a melody that needs to be played legato, nothing prevents you from doubling it on another instrument or instruments, playing non-legato or even staccato. This will help the melody stand out from the background. Texture refers to the rhythmic and melodic relationships between the instruments, in other words, what is known as counterpoint. The type of texture used as the background for a melody can make it easier or harder to perceive. However, this is linked to the degree of freedom that the piece we want to orchestrate gives, unless it's an original composition, of course. Let's look at an example. In this passage, the left-hand accompaniment is so vague that it can be orchestrated in different ways. Let's compare two versions. Here, the accompaniment is very simple and light, so the melody does not have to compete with it. In this second version, however, the accompaniment is very intricate, so much so that it can distract our attention from the melody. In Gestalt psychology, the figure-ground principle states that we perceive objects either in the foreground or in the background. An element in the music can be highlighted by the number of instruments involved, such as when a solo instrument is opposed to the rest of the orchestra, dynamics, giving the musicians who play it a higher dynamic than the rest of the orchestra, register, considering that our perception better perceives the highest and lowest pitches of a set, timbre, using a timbre that better stands out from the desired accompaniment, articulation, using different simultaneous articulations, and texture, choosing a suitable texture that doesn't tarnish the element. Thank you for watching this video, and subscribe to be notified when I post a new one. I give private lessons online on orchestration. If you want to know more, click on the linked video or visit my website. The link is in the description below.